Greek is hard at the beginning Greek level, but it doesn't always get easier just because you finish beginning Greek. And in this video, I'm going to talk about a number of questions that people who have gone a little bit further on in Greek have struggled with. But also, as we start, I was asked the other day a question about whether somebody should learn using the natural language acquisition approach or whether they should learn using the grammar translate method. And I want to just talk about these two things just very briefly before we go on. And the first one is natural language acquisition. So this is a learning approach based on how a 2 to 4-year-old learns language. And the idea behind this is that you can naturally pick up the language and certain vocabulary and so on just by starting to use it in an active sense. So you're actually having small little conversations, saying, my name is whatever and so on and so forth, and having back and forths like this. On the other side, there is the grammar translate method, which is the historical method that's been used for the last 400-500 years by seminarians and so on for actually learning to be able to work with the Greek of the New Testament and other Greek texts as well. How do you make a decision between these two? Which is better? Which one should I use? Here's the key thing I think that it comes down to. Historically, we have taught grammar throughout schools. In fact, grammar has been a core foundational part of our elementary school system for millennia, for millennia. So grammar has been something that has been taught in schools for thousands of years, and it has historically been the foundation of learning new languages, because the idea was once you've learned how the grammar of your language works, well, you can apply that same thinking to another language and pick it up pretty easily. This is the way the ancient Greeks learned different language, for instance. There's a long pedigree of this. And the problem today, of course, is that we're not learning grammar in school, which means that we don't have that foundation to go and learn new languages, and we don't have that foundation that we can then compare my language against another language to say, oh, this is a preposition, this is a preposition, this is how prepositions work here, this is how they work here. We don't have that basis for comparison. And so the natural language acquisition approach has grown up in the void of this education that we've historically had. And it's come out of this idea that, okay, we just learn language easily as a 2 to 4-year-old, so why can't we just emulate that? Now, the good thing about the natural language approach is it does allow you to develop the active skill of speaking the language, which in turn gives you the passive skill of being able to understand the language when it's spoken or, in many cases, even read. The problem is, though, that much of the study of the Bible throughout the centuries has actually been based on this grammatical approach to learning the language. So if you really want to study the Bible and use a lot of those resources that have been written over the last hundreds of years, then you're going to need to know the grammar as well. And the problem that I've come across with people who start and only work with the natural language acquisition approach is that they actually are resistant to learning the grammar because they've never learned it, they've never had to learn it. They've kind of got the knowledge of the language that maybe a 5-year-old might have, and they can speak it, which is great, but they still don't actually understand how language works, and they don't therefore understand the differences in the use of a genitive or a dative or whatever it happens to be. And it may be they don't care, and that's fine. But if your goal is to study the Bible and be able to use those exegetical resources, then you want to make sure that the approach you take to learning the language is actually going to give you those skills as well. It's one thing to be able to read the Bible in the original language, and there's a lot of benefit in being able to do that, but if you really want to go deep, if you really want to do exegesis, if you really want to study the Bible, if you really want to use the resources of people who have studied the Bible over the years and centuries, then you need to understand the terms and the grammar and all those kinds of elements that come with it. Now, that may not be your goal, and that's totally fine. But the goal here of what I'm trying to give you is there is a difference in outcome that you get between these two approaches. But I think there's a big difference between the two approaches to learning the language, and I think it depends on your goal. And certainly, you can get a good head start perhaps using the natural language approach, but the grammar translate method has its own benefits as well. And I don't think the answer is one or the other. I think the answer ultimately is to sort of try and bring these things together and help develop more active skills for people who are learning beginning Greek, but really focusing still on developing the understanding of the grammar so you can interact with those study resources that are we're so rich in that from a biblical studies perspective. So we want to pull those two worlds together. So that's all I'm going to say on that for the moment. Here's another question. How long does it take to learn the vocabulary of the New Testament? And this is a question that is important because if you're learning the language, and part of your goal is to be able to read the Bible in the original language, you need to know the vocabulary of the New Testament to be able to do that fluently. And there's a whole bunch of approaches. In fact, the first thing I ever developed as I started getting into this whole world was what we call the Greek Vocab Pack today. And this is a set of vocabulary for the entire New Testament, ordered from the easy books to the hardest books. And you can just download it and use the vocabulary for yourself and learn the vocabulary book by book. So that as you go, you're actually able to read entire books of the New Testament and develop the skills related to that as well. And of course, because we're starting from the easiest book, it's easy to sort of build skills with those easy books and then develop into some of the more difficult ones later on. The approach here, the point of all of this is to say that if you don't know the vocabulary, you really are going to struggle to develop the skills to actually read the New Testament because you're constantly going to be looking up words. And I've already put out a couple of videos talking about this. So if you're interested in those, take a look at the cards up here and they'll give you a bit more information. But typically I recommend that you seek to know the vocabulary so you're not dependent on tools, reader's editions and things like that. That way, as you read text, you can actually see the words, how they're being used, and you're not constrained by your lack of knowledge and going up and down in the text and ultimately relying on the vocabulary glosses that you find at the bottom of the page. This gives you a much more natural understanding of the language and I think is going to help you really develop your reading skills as well. So using this method that I came up with, it took me about 3.5-ish years to learn the vocabulary for the Greek New Testament. I've had other people who have purchased the Greek Vocab Pack who have learned the vocabulary in 2 years. However, that comes with its own issues, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So I think it's a better and more realistic goal is to sort of think of this as taking 4 to maybe 6 years, depending on the amount of time and attention you can give to it, depending on your capacity, mental capacity. We all have different brains, we all think differently, we all memorize things differently, and I think all of those are factors in this. So I don't think there's any one size fits all in terms of how long should it take me to learn the vocabulary of the New Testament. It's going to depend on how the Lord has designed you and your capabilities. Which comes to another question, and that is, do you tend to forget words? And the answer is yeah, it's easy to forget vocabulary words, right? But here's one thing that I've noticed with this, and this goes back to that question about, should I learn the vocabulary and do it in 2 years? The challenge with learning the vocabulary is that your skills and your vocabulary really need to go together. If your vocabulary is racing on ahead, let's say you've got a great memory for vocabulary, but you're struggling to be able to read the Greek and you don't have the understanding of how the language is formed and working, then knowing all that vocabulary is really not much good to you. So really what you want to do is focus on developing your skills with the language at the same time as you're developing your vocabulary. So what this really means at the end of the day is as you learn new vocabulary, focus on reading the texts that vocabulary is found in, and then reread the text that vocabulary is found in. That helps you to internalize the structures of those texts and how the vocabulary is being used. And while you're reading those texts for the first time, second time, or third time, I also would say go back to previous texts that you've already learned and reread those as well. And then once you've done a number of readings of that new piece of text, then go on to the next one as well. And this way you're sort of adding new material to your repertoire of what you've done. And this is why I love the idea of reading through the entire Greek New Testament and developing your knowledge of the vocabulary at the same time. Because it means that as you develop your knowledge of the vocabulary, you're reading more of the Greek New Testament, and it gets increasingly difficult as time goes on, not just from a lexical point of view, but also from a syntactical point of view as well, which means that you're being forced to really use all of those skills together. And so your skills development and your vocabulary development need to go together. If you shortchange your vocabulary, you're going to struggle with the skills, because if you don't know the words, you're going to be bouncing up and down looking up the words at the bottom of the page. But on the other hand, if you know all the vocabulary, but you don't do the reading, then that's not going to help you much either. So you need to make sure those two things work together and you progress both of those at the same pace and at the same time. And that's what we focus on inside of our membership, and that's what we focus on in the Greek Vocab Pack as well. And so as you get more advanced in your Greek, as you get a greater vocabulary, the question then becomes, well, how do I manage this huge growing set of vocabulary? And the answer to that is, what you're going to find is that some of those words are going to become kind of second nature. Didomi, for instance. You see this everywhere in the New Testament, and therefore you're probably not going to need to review that particular word all the time. In fact, you're going to see more occurrences of compounds with that word than you're going to see of that actual word itself. So you're going to get used to seeing that word, and you're going to understand how it's being used and so on. So you don't need to review that all the time. So over time, as you get used to these words, you should get to a point where you're reviewing those no more than once a year. And what I do is once they get to a once a year kind of review state, then I just exclude them and I stop reviewing them entirely. And that would be a great approach to, over time, just reducing the words that you do actually need to review. So you need to focus on the words that you see less often, the words such as hapax legomena with unusual roots that you're unlikely to see unless you're reading, say, Acts chapter 27 or whatever it happens to be. So, you know, those are the texts then that you want to go back over and reread as well. And not only that, but those words are the ones you're going to want to work on. So this then helps you to sort of reduce the scope of your vocabulary over time as you acquire new words, and hopefully not lose the words that you've learned. But if you do find that you are not seeing a word often enough and you start to forget it in your vocabulary, well, just reduce the amount of time between when you see that next and just sort of work your way back up again. So the last question then is, Greek is a lot of work, and I get up in the morning and it's the last thing I want to do because it's so hard. I get that. I totally get that. Again, going back to what we talked about before, the difficulty of working with Greek is going to be directly related to your reading skills. So if Greek is really feeling really hard this week or today, then maybe you want to mix it up a little bit. Maybe there's a way of reading through texts that you've already read a number of times that you're kind of familiar with and adding smaller amounts of new text. And here's where I would say Bible reading plans are not necessarily super helpful. And that would include the idea of adding new texts that you haven't read too quickly. So I would encourage you to focus on reading and rereading the texts you've already read, making that a focus, because that's the easy material to read. And then add just a little bit of new material to read every week. But here's the key thing at the same time, is reading and rereading is critical. Reading repeatedly is going to be helpful, but also reading expansively. And again, inside our membership, we have our Greek workshop calls where we read texts like this month. It's going to be Exodus 19, which you're probably not going to read a whole lot. And again, as you read it through the month, it's going to make it more familiar. So you probably want to get into a pattern where you're not only reading repeatedly, but reading more expansively as well, particularly as your vocabulary grows and you get the ability to read quite broadly in the Septuagint, because this is what happens. Once you finish the Greek New Testament and you know the vocabulary for that, there's actually not that many words in the Old Testament Septuagint that you actually don't know. So read more expansively and then go into the Apostolic Fathers. Read some of the texts by Chrysostom and other people who wrote in Greek back during and near to the Koine period. So that would be my encouragement, is just, yes, it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of work because you're still developing your skills. Therefore, you want to expand your skills. You want to do that in a systematic way, but you also want to go back and get the satisfaction of reading and rereading texts that are much easier for you. So that would be my encouragement. What questions do you have about learning Greek, or even further on, more advanced Greek questions like the ones we've been talking about today? I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment in the comment section below. And if you've actually solved any of these questions or problems, again, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you there as well. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it's been a blessing to you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. I'll see you then.